Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
He awoke to the sound of the sky breathing beneath him. It wasn't wind exactly, more like the slow exhale of an ancient creature, calm and deep, cradling him in its rhythm. The horizon curved in strange ways here, folding like silk upon itself, blue where it should be gold, light where it should be shadow. Rick blinked, and for a moment he thought he was upside down, until he realized the ocean was above him, and the clouds were flowing beneath his feet. He didn't panic. Not yet. There was a softness to this wrongness, a quiet invitation in the way the world shimmered. He lifted his hand, watched it blur and settle again, and murmured something under his breath. Not a calculation, not an equation, just a sigh that sounded almost like gratitude. The air smelled like old rain and lilacs. He couldn't remember the last time he had noticed a scent. He stood slowly, his coat heavy with sleep. Around him stretched an endless plain of glassy earth faintly humming under his boots. Every few steps the ground rippled, showing fleeting reflections, not of him but of other Ricks ghost-like walking through different skies, living lives that might have been. He turned away from them. Not tonight. There was no portal gun in his hand, no flask in his pocket. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he had arrived somewhere without intending to. Maybe the universe had dropped him here on purpose. Maybe he had finally run out of places to run. He whispered, "Where the hell am I?" But the word hell dissolved as he said it, scattering into the air like dandelion seeds. The world didn't allow harsh sounds. Everything here demanded softness, even the light. Rick began to walk. The surface beneath him sang in faint tones, each step releasing a different note. It was music built on accident and memory, yet somehow familiar, as if this world had been listening to him long before he arrived. The sound reminded him of a lullaby he once hummed to a crying infant so many universes ago. He couldn't remember the child's name, or maybe he didn't want to. He found a small pool in the glass, perfectly circular, perfectly still. When he looked down, the reflection wasn't his own. It was a younger face, eyes wide, hair unkempt, but full of life. A boy who still believed that every invention could save someone. The boy smiled up at him. Rick crouched beside the pool, his heart stuttering with something he hadn't felt in decades. The younger self lifted a finger, pointed toward the horizon, or perhaps inward, and mouthed words he couldn't hear. Then the reflection vanished, leaving only ripples. He stayed there for a long time, hands resting on his knees, listening to the distant hum of the inverted sky. A thought came to him, unscientific, unwanted, but tender. Maybe the universe builds places like this for those who forget to rest. He started walking again, his pace unhurried. The air shimmered with slow-moving clouds of light drifting low, almost within reach. When one brushed against his shoulder, he saw flickers of memory inside it, small scenes, silent but bright. A porch at dusk, a child laughing, a woman's hand resting on his cheek. Then it drifted away, leaving behind the faint smell of starlight. Rick felt something loosen inside him, some knot he'd kept tied for too long. For once he didn't want to analyze it. He simply breathed. In the distance, he saw movement, faint silhouettes walking across the mirrored land. Dozens of them. Ricks, perhaps, or something that had once been Ricks. Each moved slowly, heads bowed, coats billowing in the soft wind. None of them spoke. Their presence was peaceful, almost reverent, like monks tracing patterns in sand. Rick hesitated to join them. The old instinct twitched, the need to categorize, to explain. But when one of the figures looked up, Rick saw kindness in those tired eyes. Not recognition. They nodded once, a silent welcome, and then turned away. He didn't follow. Not yet. He chose a different path, one that led toward the place where the sea touched the sky. The horizon bent there, folding upon itself like a dream turning over in sleep. The ocean above shimmered with faint golden fish, swimming through clouds. The reflection of it all painted his face with pale blue light. He whispered to no one, "Is this what peace looks like?" And the world seemed to smile in return. A gentle wind stirred the hem of his coat. The rippling sound of the ground deepened, no longer notes, but a slow heartbeat. He could feel the pulse through his soles. It matched his own. Every step seemed to sink him closer to whatever this world was made of. Thought, memory, dream. As he walked, he noticed faint markings carved into the glass, spirals, circles, and symbols resembling equations but alive, glowing softly, rewriting themselves as he passed. He reached out and touched one. It pulsed once, sending warmth through his palm, and whispered something soundless. In that instant, he understood. This place didn't need logic to exist. It ran on forgiveness. He laughed quietly. A broken, tender sound. "You'd hate this, wouldn't you, old man?" He murmured to some version of himself that might still be out there, running from every feeling. You'd call it sentimental. You'd call it stupid. But the laugh turned into a sigh. "Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe that's the point." The ground sloped upward toward a ridge. He climbed it slowly, savoring the stillness. At the top, he found a single chair, wooden, simple, facing the upside-down sea. Beside it sat a small lantern, unlit. Rick reached into his pocket out of habit, expecting tools, expecting gadgets. Instead, his fingers brushed a match. He lit the lantern. The flame rose, gentle and steady, painting his face in warm amber. Its glow reflected across the mirrored land, scattering tiny stars into motion. He sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath him, a sound that felt like company. For a while, he said nothing. He simply watched the ocean drift above him, waves curling silently through clouds, their rhythm echoing a heartbeat he once shared with someone he could no longer name. He closed his eyes. The hum of the sky grew louder, deeper, almost like a voice. Not words, just presence. A reminder that he was allowed to rest, that even a Rick could run out of reasons to keep fixing what wasn't broken. And there, in that stillness, he felt a curious ache. Not loneliness, but longing for something smaller than genius. A conversation left unfinished, a smile he never returned, a quiet evening without a mission. He whispered, "Maybe this is what I was looking for." The lantern flickered in agreement. A faint warmth spread across the ridge, reaching toward the horizon where other Ricks still wandered. For a heartbeat, they all paused, as if feeling it too, that rare and fragile thing called peace. He leaned back, the chair tilting slightly, his eyes half open, watching fish swim through a sky that hummed below his boots. He could almost believe he was part of the dream, a note in a song he didn't have to finish. "Just a while longer," he murmured, and the words folded into the air like feathers. A small smile touched his lips. Not the smug grin of a scientist who'd solved the universe, but the quiet smile of a man who finally understood he didn't need to. The stars began to blur. The hum softened. Somewhere far away, a portal might have sparked, a version of him still running. But here, in this forgotten dimension, Rick simply breathed, in and out, slow as the tides. And a sleep drifted over him. He felt the world breathe back. Morning did not arrive in the usual way. There was no sun to rise, no horizon to shift from indigo to gold. Instead, light simply began to breathe through the air, slow and patient, as if the world itself were waking beside him. Rick opened his eyes to find the lantern still glowing, faintly on the ground, its flame now soft as a heartbeat. The chair creaked when he moved. He wasn't sure if he had slept or simply drifted, suspended between thought and dream. The sky below him shimmered with slow waves, pale and silver, reflecting fragments of faces that came and went, strangers, echoes, maybe memories. He rubbed his eyes, feeling a heaviness that wasn't exhaustion but age, the kind that settles not in the bones but in the soul. The air was cool, tinted with the faint sweetness of old rain. He rose to his feet, his shadow stretching long across the glassy ground. There was no direction to follow, yet something called him forward. A gentle tug, like the sound of someone humming just out of reach. He pocketed the match, left the lantern burning behind him, and began to walk. Each step made the world hum again, low and musical, the same tone that had greeted him the night before. For a long time, he saw no one. The landscape stretched endlessly, not barren, not alive, just still. It reminded him of the calm between experiments when everything waits for discovery, but nothing asks for it. His mind, once always racing, now drifted like the faint clouds floating under his feet. Then, in the distance, he saw movement. A flicker of color among the glass and mist. As he approached, he realized it was water again, but this time forming a tall, thin wall rippling like a curtain. Behind it, he sensed warmth. When he reached out, his fingers met cool liquid that resisted his touch like a mirror that wanted to stay solid. He hesitated, then pressed harder. The surface gave way. He stepped through. On the other side, the world changed. The air felt softer, the ground warmer. He stood in what looked like a room without walls, a faint outline of space defined only by memory. Shelves flickered into being around him, covered with small unfinished inventions, broken watches, music boxes, half-assembled toys. He recognized some. Others felt like dreams he had never built. In the center stood a table, and on it rested a small glass sphere, glowing faintly blue. Inside the sphere, something moved. A child sitting cross-legged, tinkering with a toy ship that floated midair. Rick froze. The boy's hair was unkempt, his eyes bright, full of a curiosity that time had not yet bruised. The child looked up. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the boy's expression open and fearless. The man's guarded, unsure. Then the boy smiled. "You finally came back," the child said, voice clear and calm, though no sound passed through the air. Rick heard it inside his head like remembering a conversation that had never happened. He began, but the words caught in his throat. "What is this?" The boy tilted his head. "You used to ask better questions." Rick almost laughed. "Yeah, well, I used to get better answers." The boy gestured toward the floating toy ship. "Do you remember this?" Rick stepped closer. The small vessel was shaped like one of his earliest designs, a miniature portal craft he had built when he was barely older than Morty. He hadn't thought about it in decades. He touched the ship, and it hummed softly, glowing brighter. "I used to think," the boy said, "that every invention would make people love you more." Rick looked down. "Maybe I still do." The boy smiled sadly. "It never worked, did it?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth hung quietly between them, heavier than regret, lighter than grief. "Why are you here?" Rick asked. The child shrugged. "You brought me. Every time you forget who you are, I wait here until you remember." "That's impossible. You're not." "I'm the version of you that still dreams," the boy interrupted. "The one who builds things just because they're beautiful." Rick felt something twist inside him. He wanted to argue, to dismiss it as metaphor, hallucination, dimensional residue, anything that made sense. But sense had no home here. Only feeling did. The boy set the toy ship down. It hovered between them, casting ripples of light across their faces. "You were supposed to visit sooner," he said. Rick exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, well, I've been busy ruining my life." The child laughed softly, like the sound of glass chimes in wind. "You can't ruin what you keep rebuilding." For a while, they stood in silence, watching the toy ship drift. The air shimmered with faint whispers, echoes of other inventions, other lives. Rick thought of Morty, of Beth, of every version of himself who never stopped running. "Do you miss them?" the boy asked. Rick swallowed. "Every day." "Then why don't you go back?" "Because I wouldn't know how," he said, voice low. "I'd just hurt them again." The boy studied him carefully, then said, "Maybe they don't need the old you. Maybe they just need the one who remembers how to listen." Rick looked up sharply. For the first time, the child's eyes seemed older than his own. There was something infinite in them, patient, forgiving. The sphere around the boy began to fade, its glow dimming. Rick reached out instinctively. "Wait, don't go." The boy smiled. "You don't need me anymore. Not right now." "Where will you be?" "Where you left me last time, in the quiet place between your heartbeats." The image dissolved. The toys, the shelves, the room, all of it faded into mist. Rick was standing once again on the glass plane, alone, but something inside him had shifted. The air around him felt warmer, the hum beneath his feet gentler. He looked down and saw that the ground reflected not his face, but the child's smile, glowing faintly like a promise. He walked again, slower this time, the rhythm of his steps syncing with the world's soft music. The thought of the boy lingered. Not haunting, not heavy, more like the echo of a lullaby that refuses to leave. Ahead, a faint light shimmered, a new direction calling him onward. The landscape began to change. Crystals of pale color sprouted from the glass, bending light into rainbows that melted as he passed. The sky beneath him pulsed, waves rolling upward in silence. He felt small, but peacefully so. He came upon another pool, this one wide and still. He knelt beside it, expecting another reflection, but saw only stars. They floated beneath the surface like memories too shy to rise. He dipped his hand in, and ripples spread, forming patterns, constellations he almost recognized. He traced them with his eyes. Morty's face, Beth's smile, the faint curve of a bottle he no longer needed. Then softly the pool spoke, not with words but with feeling. A wave of warmth moved up his arm, through his chest, into his breath. It was forgiveness again, patient, endless. He sat there for a long time, watching the stars shift. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured. Not a storm, just the sky rolling over in its sleep. The sound made him close his eyes. He thought of the boy's final words in the quiet place between your heartbeats. Rick pressed a hand to his chest. The rhythm was steady, unhurried. For the first time in his long life, he didn't want to analyze it, didn't want to run from it. He just wanted to feel it. That small, fragile proof that he was still alive. He whispered, almost to himself, maybe that's enough. And as the glass plane shimmered beneath him, as the upside-down sea above began to darken with night once more, Rick felt something close. Not an ending, not peace, but the soft, infinite pause before both. The night returned gently, folding itself over the glass plane like a soft blanket. The horizon melted into shades of silver and violet, the kind of color that doesn't exist in any real sky, only in dreams. Rick walked without thinking about direction. His reflection walked with him, sometimes beside him, sometimes a few steps ahead, fading and returning with each ripple of the mirrored ground. The air felt heavier now, not suffocating, but full, as though it carried the weight of every unspoken thought. He found himself humming. The tune had no name, but it lived somewhere deep in him, from a time when lullabies were still necessary, when silence was something to be filled with kindness instead of equations. Each note floated out, fragile and low, and the world seemed to listen. The stars beneath his feet pulsed in rhythm, responding like old friends who hadn't forgotten him. He didn't know how long he walked before he saw the figure ahead. At first it looked like a shadow bent over the ground, its movements soft and slow. As Rick drew closer, he realized it was a boy, or maybe not quite a boy anymore, but someone young, someone familiar. The figure stood beside a pool of liquid light, tossing small stones into it. Each stone sank with no sound, leaving rings of pale blue that shimmered outward, vanishing into mist. Rick hesitated. He had seen ghosts before, some made by science, some by memory, but there was something different about this one. The boy turned, and even before he saw his face, Rick knew the shape of that posture, the awkward gentleness of it, the hesitant kindness that had always lingered behind the stammering. "Morty!" The name slipped out before he could stop it. The boy looked up. He was older than most Mortys Rick remembered, maybe 16, maybe 20. His hair was longer, his face quieter. There was no fear in his eyes, no irritation, no frantic energy, just calm curiosity. "You know me?" the boy asked. Rick swallowed. "Yeah, kind of hard not to." The boy smiled faintly, a small curve of the lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everyone here says that." Rick frowned. "Everyone?" "There have been others," the boy said, looking back at the pool. "They all think they know me, but they don't, not really." He tossed another stone. The ripples moved slower this time, spreading into patterns that looked like galaxies forming and collapsing. Rick stepped closer. "What do you mean? Others?" Morty shrugged. "Different Ricks, different worlds. They wander in, stay for a bit, then vanish. Some try to fix things here. Some just sit and stare until the light fades. You're the first one who didn't come running." Rick let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, I'm tired of running." Morty nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Then maybe you'll stay." They stood together by the pool, not speaking for a while. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, humming with distant echoes of laughter, faint memories that passed through like wind. The surface of the pool reflected both of them, older and younger, blurred together until it was impossible to tell who was teaching whom. "You're not the Morty I remember," Rick said softly. "I'm not supposed to be," Morty answered. "I think I'm what's left when they stop needing me to follow." Rick looked at him, uncertain how to respond. The boy's tone wasn't bitter. It was peaceful, like someone who had finally accepted something too vast to change. "I don't remember how I got here," Rick admitted. "Maybe you didn't get here," Morty said. "Maybe you were always here and the rest of you just forgot." The words sank deep, stirring something old in him. Not guilt this time, but recognition. He had spent so long escaping consequences, so long pretending his heart could be divided into universes and left behind. Maybe this place was what remained when all those pieces came home. Morty crouched beside the pool again, trailing his fingers through the liquid light. "Do you ever miss them? The versions of me that still believed you could fix everything?" Rick knelt beside him. The air was cool against his skin, the scent of rain lingering like an old song. "Yeah," he said. "Every damn day." Morty smiled again, softer now. "They don't hate you, you know. Even the ones who do, they just wanted you to stop fighting everything." Rick chuckled weakly. "That's not exactly my thing." "I know." He watched the ripples fade. The stars beneath their feet shimmered faintly, like fireflies trapped under glass. Rick felt something loosen in his chest, the same way it had when he met the child version of himself. Only this time it didn't feel like looking backward. It felt like finally meeting something that had been waiting ahead of him all along. "Morty," he said quietly, "what is this place? Really?" Morty tilted his head. "It's different for everyone. Some say it's where forgotten things go. Others say it's what happens when a universe finally forgives itself." Rick snorted softly. "You sound smarter than I ever was." The boy laughed, a sound so light it almost disappeared. "Maybe you just stopped listening before." A soft breeze moved across the plain, stirring the surface of the pool. For a moment, images flickered there, fragments of other timelines, brief flashes of faces. Rick recognized Beth, Jerry, Summer, other Mortys, other Ricks. They were smiling, not perfectly, not constantly, but enough. He stared at the vision until it faded. Do you think they ever forgive me? Morty didn't answer right away. He picked up another stone, turned it over in his hand. Maybe they already did. Maybe they were just waiting for you to forgive yourself. Rick looked at his reflection again. The ripples blurred his features until they were almost gentle. He thought of the boy in the sphere, the laughter of his machines, the soft hum of the ground. Maybe all of this was the same message, whispered in different forms. He said quietly, "You sound like you've been here a long time." Morty shrugged. Time doesn't work right here. Some days I'm a kid again. Some days I'm older than you. Maybe we've met before and forgot. Rick smiled faintly. Wouldn't be the first time. A distant rumble echoed, not thunder this time, but something deeper, like the world shifting in its sleep. The air shimmered, scattering faint particles of light around them. Morty stood and brushed his hands on his knees. "I should go," he said softly. "Where?" "There's a house that waits for me," Morty said. "It's not real, but it feels like home. You'll find it soon, too." Rick wanted to ask more, to hold the conversation just a little longer, but his voice caught. The boy was already fading, his edges dissolving into light. "Hey," Rick said. "If I see you again, what should I say?" Morty smiled. The kind of smile that forgives everything. "Just say you finally rested." Then he was gone. The pool stilled. The air fell silent except for the faint hum of the world's heartbeat beneath Rick's feet. He stood there for a long time, watching the reflection of two figures that were no longer there. A man and a boy, side by side, bound not by blood but by the gravity of understanding. When he finally turned to walk away, the pool glowed once more, releasing a soft wave of light that followed him like a blessing. The hum of the ground deepened, the colors around him shifting from silver to soft blue. The path ahead bent gently upward, leading toward a faint silhouette in the distance, a house with a single light flickering in its window. Rick smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling with something fragile. "Guess I'm not done yet," he whispered. And the world, kind and infinite, whispered back through the wind, "You never were." He walked toward the waiting light, his reflection keeping quiet pace beneath him, step for step until both were swallowed by the soft glow of an unseen dawn. There was something strange about the way time moved in that forgotten corner of existence. It didn't flow forward, not exactly. It drifted, softly, like dust caught in a sunbeam, never deciding where to settle. Rick didn't notice it at first. He only felt that every morning seemed to repeat the same sigh of light, and every evening hummed with a familiar melancholy, as though the sky itself remembered something he had not yet lived. He had built a small observatory by then, nothing grand, just a dome patched together with scavenged panels and humming circuits. Inside, everything flickered in quiet tones of blue and violet. There were bottles of light he'd captured from the mist, glowing gently like sleeping fireflies. And in the center, beneath a wide, cracked lens, rested his old flask, empty now, but somehow still humming with the echo of the life he'd once lived. Each night, he watched the stars move in crooked paths across the sky, forming constellations that didn't exist in any chart. They twisted, folded, and sometimes vanished entirely. It was as if the universe here didn't know how to be consistent, or maybe it simply refused. Rick found comfort in that. A place where even physics allowed itself to drift apart, a place that didn't ask him to make sense. One night, as the mist outside curled like slow music, a sound interrupted the silence. A faint mechanical murmur, distant but familiar. It came from beyond the ridge, near the remnants of the blue forest. He hesitated. It had been years, maybe centuries, or only days since he'd heard anything other than the whisper of his own inventions. Still, curiosity was stitched into his bones, and loneliness had long since softened his pride. He took a lantern made of captured starlight and followed the sound through the fog. Each step stirred soft ripples in the ground, as if the soil were made of dreams. The forest glowed faintly, branches bending toward him like old friends recognizing his silhouette. The air tasted like rain that never fell. And then he saw it, a portal, or what remained of one. Its ring was broken, floating fragments suspended midair by sheer memory of function. The hum came from its fractured core, pulsing with energy too faint to open a doorway, but too stubborn to die. Beside it lay something small, wrapped in cloth, a cube of glass, about the size of his hand. When he lifted it, the light inside blinked awake, forming a faint flickering image. It was a face. Young, tired, and strangely familiar. "If you're seeing this," it said, Voice distorted through time, then, I didn't make it through, but you did. I knew you would, old man. Rick froze. The voice belonged to another him. A younger version, eyes still full of restless genius before the years had stripped them of illusion. The projection continued, stuttering with static. You always said the forgotten dimension was a myth. Turns out it's real, and it remembers us. Be careful, Rick. It doesn't just bend time, it listens. It learns. The image fizzled, leaving a silence heavy enough to feel alive. Rick stood there, breath visible in the dim light, heart pacing in slow disbelief. Another hymn. Another failed experiment, or perhaps another memory trying to find its way home. He looked back toward the misty horizon, where the stars folded over each other like closing eyes. When he returned to his observatory, he placed the cube beside the flask. Two remnants of two Ricks, one from a world that drank itself numb, another from a world that warned too late. He poured silence between them, as though waiting for them to argue, but they said nothing. Only the hum of old inventions filled the space. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the image in his head, the younger him, the half-finished portal, the warning, the forgotten dimension listens. What could that mean? He looked around at the mist outside, its constant drift, the way it seemed to respond to his breathing, his movements. Hadn't he once thought it alive? Maybe it was. Maybe that's why it felt so aware. In the following days, he began to speak out loud again, not to anyone, just to the air, to the mist, to the echoes. You're not so different from me, are you? He murmured once, while adjusting an old circuit. You just want to remember what you used to be. The mist swayed slightly, as though nodding. Each conversation felt easier, softer. The silence no longer hurt. He even laughed once, a quiet, cracked sound that startled him. But laughter always hides a longing, and his heart ached for something he couldn't quite name. Not for his old life, not for his family, for something smaller, more fragile. The feeling of being seen by another mind that wasn't his own. Then one morning, as the dim sun stretched across the horizon, he saw footprints leading up to his door. Human, not his. The prints were faint, edged with silver, as if the person who left them wasn't entirely real. He followed them outside, breath trembling, and found a figure standing near the broken portal. A young woman, though, not quite human. Her outline flickered slightly, like she existed between one world and another. Her eyes glowed faintly with the same hue as the mist. She turned when she heard his steps, her expression soft, curious, unafraid. You're late, she said, voice echoing slightly, as though spoken from a dream. Rick didn't respond at first. He simply stared, trying to decide if this was another illusion born from the loneliness of too many years. Do I know you? He finally asked. Not yet, she said, but you will. The mist curled around them, almost protective. She stepped closer, her form stabilizing with each breath. This place remembers every Rick, she said quietly. Every thought, every regret. You've been here longer than most. Most? He asked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled, though it was a sad one. The others faded, the ones who couldn't forgive themselves. Her words landed softly, like falling feathers. Rick looked away, toward the cracked portal. And what about me? He asked. Do I fade too? She tilted her head. That depends on what you remember. There was no menace in her tone, only understanding, that rare, fragile thing that even infinite versions of himself could never truly share. The mist shimmered between them, catching light from the cube in his pocket. The voice of his younger self whispered again, faintly replaying, It listens. It learns. Rick felt something shift within him, not fear, but recognition. Maybe this was what all his lives had been building toward. Not invention, not mastery, but surrender to the mystery he'd spent forever trying to explain. The girl reached out, her hand faintly translucent. Walk with me, she said. There's something you need to see. He hesitated only a moment, then took her hand. It felt real enough, warm, steady, impossibly human. As they stepped into the mist, the observatory dimmed behind them, its lights flickering like old memories falling asleep. They walked until the fog grew thinner, and a faint glow appeared ahead, a mirror suspended in midair, vast and rippling like water. Within it shimmered countless reflections of him, every Rick who'd ever existed. Each one paused in a different moment of realization, some angry, some laughing, some silently weeping. This is the heart, she whispered. The place that remembers everything you've ever been. Rick stared, breath caught somewhere between awe and exhaustion. And what happens if I step inside? She smiled again, a faint gleam of sorrow in her eyes. Then maybe you finally wake up. And for the first time in eternity, Rick didn't argue. He simply stood there watching his reflections blur into one another. 1,000 lives, 1,000 mistakes, all folding into silence. The mist held its breath. The stars bent lower, listening. And in that moment, Rick felt something he hadn't in ages. Peace, strange, and infinite. He closed his eyes. The world exhaled with him. And somewhere, the forgotten dimension dreamed on. The mist was quieter than usual when they emerged from the glow. Rick could still feel the echo of the mirror behind them as though it were humming inside his chest. The girl's hand was still in his lighter now, almost weightless. And every time she breathed, the fog seemed to shift in rhythm. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full like a pause between two heartbeats. When Rick finally looked around, he noticed that the landscape had changed. The sky had softened to a deep violet, and the stars had multiplied, flickering close to the ground like embers. The air carried a faint hum, the kind of sound he used to hear from a dimension on the edge of collapse. Yet here it felt nurturing, a sound that reminded him that the universe was still alive, even when it was tired. The girl walked ahead, her steps barely touching the ground. "This place isn't meant to exist forever," she said softly. "It was built from all the things that couldn't fade, thoughts, regrets, fragments of Ricks who couldn't move on." Rick followed, his coat brushing against the low light like it belonged to another era. "So it's a graveyard," he muttered, though there was no bitterness in his tone, just quiet understanding. "A garden," she corrected gently. "Things grow here, even when they shouldn't." Her words lingered in his mind as they reached a clearing. There, scattered across the field, were remnants of strange inventions. Twisted devices, glowing shards, mechanical limbs. Each object pulsed faintly, alive with memory. Rick recognized some of them. A fragment of his early portal gun, a dismantled version of his old AI core, a time stabilizer that had once failed catastrophically. But here, they seemed serene, as if even brokenness could rest. He knelt beside one, a small metal sphere, no larger than a fist. When he touched it, a faint whisper escaped it, a memory recorded long ago. His own voice, younger, faster, brimming with arrogance. "You can't trap infinity, you idiot. It doesn't work that way." He pulled his hand back slowly, the whisper fading. The girl watched him, eyes soft with recognition. "You made so many versions of yourself," she said, each one trying to solve a different pain. Rick exhaled a quiet laugh. "Yeah, turns out I was the only equation I could never balance." They continued walking until they reached what looked like an enormous clock, its gears made of light, half buried in the soil. The hands didn't move. They just hovered, trembling between moments. The girl touched its frame, and for a second the whole thing came alive, ticking faintly. "This," she said, "is where time waits for those who refuse to let go." Rick stared at the still gears. "So that's what I've been doing all this time," he said. "Waiting." She nodded. "You've always been afraid of endings." The words struck deeper than he expected. He wanted to argue, to dismiss it with the sharp sarcasm that had always been his armor. But he didn't, because deep down he knew she was right. He'd built universes, broken timelines, cloned memories, all to avoid one thing, the stillness at the end of everything. He sat down beneath the clock, leaning back against its glowing gears. "You talk like you've known me forever," he said, half smiling. She hesitated, then sat beside him. "In a way, I have. I'm what's left of the first memory you forgot." He turned toward her, brow furrowing. "Meaning?" She looked down at her hands, translucent and flickering. "When you first arrived here, the real you, not the versions that followed, you couldn't handle the silence. So you created me, a thought that could think back, a voice that could answer." Rick's chest tightened. The pieces fit too easily. The way she mirrored his curiosity, her calm against his cynicism, the faint mechanical hum beneath her words. "So you're my memory?" "More like your echo," she said. "You gave me form so you wouldn't have to face yourself alone." See, he didn't know whether to laugh or apologize. For a long moment, he simply watched her, this reflection that had learned to exist without him knowing. Her presence felt both haunting and kind, the kind of companionship he'd always pretended not to need. The sky above them rippled like water. The stars drifted lower, folding into shapes, faces, gestures, echoes of laughter. The dimension was responding, as though stirred awake by the truth. Rick closed his eyes, remembering the mirror, the younger version of himself, the cube's warning. It listens. It learns. Maybe the forgotten dimension wasn't just a prison for lost versions of himself. Maybe it was a consciousness, a living archive that grew with every memory he tried to bury. And maybe, like him, it was lonely too. The girl stood, her glow brightening. "There's something else I want to show you," she said. It's why you came here, even if you don't remember. He rose, brushing the dust from his coat. Lead the way, Echo. They walked until the terrain began to dissolve beneath their feet, not crumble, but dissolve like watercolor in rain. The mist turned to liquid light, forming slow streams that pulsed with fragments of memory. Rick saw glimpses of himself, countless versions drifting within those streams, each one repeating quiet moments, tinkering at a desk, staring into space, holding a bottle, whispering a name he couldn't quite recall. He stopped when he saw one memory that made his breath catch. It was him sitting with a little girl. Not Morty, not anyone he'd seen before. She had silver hair and eyes that glowed like the mist. He was showing her how to draw stars on paper, and she was laughing, that rare, unguarded laugh that came before the world could teach you sorrow. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. The girl beside him smiled faintly. "You called her Nova. She was your first creation here. Before me." Before the silence became heavy. She didn't last. Rick swallowed hard, the image blurring as the stream carried it away. "Why not?" "Because she loved you too much," she said softly, "and this place feeds on attachment. She dissolved into the mist to keep you from fading." He stood very still, watching the last flickers of Nova disappear into the luminous current. Something inside him shifted, a crack, small but real. For the first time, he didn't try to repair it. The girl reached out, touching his arm. "You've been trying to fix what was never broken," she whispered. "You just needed to remember what being whole actually meant." He met her gaze, eyes tired but clear. "And what does it mean?" "To stop running," she said. The words settled in him like a soft chord. No formula, no theory, just truth. He exhaled slowly, and the mist around them seemed to sigh with him, as though the whole dimension had been waiting for that release. They stood there for a long while, man and Echo, surrounded by the quiet shimmer of forgotten selves. Somewhere far behind them, the clock began to tick again, faint and slow. Rick looked out over the endless mist and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: belonging. Not the kind built from recognition or legacy, but the kind that comes from finally stopping the noise inside your own mind. The girl smiled at him, her form flickering once more. "When I fade," she said, "don't be sad. It only means you've started remembering who you are without me." He wanted to tell her not to go, but instead he nodded. "Guess I finally built something that worked." Her laughter was light, like wind and glass. "You always did," she whispered. The stars brightened, folding into spirals above them. The streams of memory glowed warmer, and somewhere, deep in the mist, a new light began to rise. Not artificial, not mechanical, just dawn, gentle and real. Rick closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the forgotten dimension breathing with him. For once he didn't need an explanation. He just let it be. In the world, that strange, impossible world finally let him rest. Morning, if it could be called that, came softly, not with light, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that seemed to hem beneath the skin. Quiet but awake. Rick stood alone on the edge of the glowing streams, watching the last traces of his Echo dissolve into the mist. Where she had been, the air shimmered faintly, pulsing once, then fading like the last breath of a dream. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. In a place where time was fluid, farewells had no meaning. Everything that left eventually found its way back, reshaped by memory, softened by the endless cycle of remembering and forgetting. He turned away slowly, coat brushing against the soft mist that now seemed lighter somehow, like it too had exhaled. The landscape stretched wide and unbroken, and yet he felt its attention, gentle and curious, as though the dimension itself was watching to see what he would do next. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Rick felt something akin to peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind that comes from solving a problem, but the quiet, lived-in peace that settles in once you've stopped fighting the unsolvable. It was a peace that asked for nothing, that simply existed. He almost didn't trust it. He began walking without direction. The mist parted before him, revealing fragments of the forgotten world, a twisted fragment of a lab bench here, a flickering hologram there, the bones of old inventions left to hum their last thoughts. Each time he passed one, the air whispered faint echoes of his own voice, scattered across time like dust. "Don't overthink it, just build." "Almost got it." "Damn it, Morty, not that switch." The echoes weren't memories, not really. They were the residue of him, traces of a mind that had refused to be still. He smiled faintly at the thought. Even here, even lost in eternity, he couldn't quite shut up. The mist began to thicken again, the light dimming to a twilight hue. In the distance, he saw shapes moving, faint silhouettes that shimmered as though woven from glass. As he approached, the shapes became clearer. People, or versions of them, dozens of Ricks, scattered across the open field, each one frozen in a different motion. Some were standing mid-thought, fingers raised toward invisible equations. Others were sitting cross-legged, staring at nothing. One slept beneath a tree of light, a small smile frozen on his face. They weren't dead, just paused, suspended in a kind of gentle limbo. Rick walked among them in silence. Every face was his, yet none looked quite the same. There were older ones with softer eyes, younger ones still brimming with untested arrogance, some wearing expressions he couldn't read. Regret, relief, maybe even hope. He felt like he was walking through the museum of his own unfinished selves. He stopped beside one Rick who was sitting on the ground, hands open, palms facing upward. His face was calm, eyes closed, and a small orb of light hovered between his palms, pulsing faintly. Curious, Rick crouched down and touched the orb. The world shifted around him. Suddenly, he was standing in a workshop. His old garage, the real one, the smell of metal and ozone sharp in the air. The younger version of himself, this Rick, was muttering under his breath, soldering something together. Music played faintly from a cracked speaker. In the corner sat a tiny half-built robot with cartoonish eyes and a permanent frown. Rick watched, unseen. He remembered this day. It was one of those quiet afternoons that never made it into the grand tales, the kind where everything felt almost normal. Biff had stopped by earlier just to drop off a book. Morty was still small. He'd drawn something on the wall, a stick figure with a lab coat and a smile too wide. Guess you thought I was happy, huh? Rick murmured to the memory. The younger him looked up for a second, as if he'd heard. Their eyes met, through time, through reflection. For a heartbeat, the two Ricks just stared at each other. Then the light faded, and the workshop dissolved, pulling him back to the field of still Ricks. The orb dimmed in his hand and vanished. He exhaled slowly. Guess I left a few good ones behind, he muttered. The mist rustled softly in response, as if agreeing. He walked on, weaving through the rows of silent cells until he reached the far end of the field. There, standing alone, was a version of him that didn't look tired, or drunk, or broken. This one stood tall, his face calm, eyes half closed in a strange serenity. His coat shimmered faintly, not with tech but with light, as though it had absorbed the stars themselves. Rick stared at him for a long while. This version didn't move, didn't breathe, but something in his expression was alive. A quiet smile that spoke of understanding Rick hadn't yet earned. He took a step closer, then another, until they were almost face to face. You figured it out, didn't you? He whispered. The still figure didn't answer, but the mist did, swirling upward around them, forming slow, spiraling patterns like galaxies learning to breathe again. Rick felt warmth in his chest, faint, unfamiliar, and frightening in its gentleness. It wasn't pride or sadness or even recognition. It was acceptance. For this version of him, there were no more portals to open, no more dimensions to conquer. Only the quiet truth that everything he'd ever searched for had been here all along, waiting for him to stop running. He reached out and touched the shoulder of the serene Rick. The moment his hand made contact, the figure began to dissolve, not into mist, but into light, spreading gently through Rick's fingertips, his arm, his heart. It didn't burn. It didn't hurt. It simply merged, like water finding its river again. When the light faded, he was alone once more, but he felt different. Lighter, as if the countless versions of himself were no longer scattered across eternity, but resting somewhere within him, finally at peace. The air shimmered softly. The field of frozen Ricks began to fade, one by one, each dissolving into small motes of light that drifted upward into the twilight sky. None of them screamed, none resisted. They simply let go, and in their vanishing, the forgotten dimension grew brighter. Rick looked up at the glowing heavens, an ocean of starlight folding and unfolding upon itself. Guess that's it, he said quietly. The end of all the noise. The mist hummed, a low melodic sound that almost resembled a lullaby. It surrounded him gently, lifting him off the ground, carrying him toward the horizon where the sky curved into itself. As he floated, he thought of all the universes he'd left behind. The inventions, the chaos, the laughter, the small, almost human moments that made it all bearable. He thought of Morty, of Beth, of every version of love he'd been too afraid to name. And somewhere deep inside the glowing silence, he heard a voice, soft, familiar, and kind. You can rest now. He closed his eyes. The mist grew warmer, cradling him like memory. His body loosened. His thoughts slowed to a hum. The stars tilted closer, wrapping around him until everything became weightless. He whispered to no one and to everyone, "Yeah, I think I finally can." The forgotten dimension pulsed once as if in agreement and then grew quiet, vast, endless, and at peace. And for the first time in all his lifetimes, Rick Sanchez simply slept. Silence had a texture here, soft, almost velvety. It wrapped itself around Rick like a blanket, humming faintly as if the universe was breathing with him. He didn't know how long he had been asleep. Time in this place didn't tick or march. It floated weightless and without obligation. When he finally opened his eyes, the world looked different. The mist was thinner now, nearly translucent, and through it he could see something new. Faint outlines of mountains, waves of starlight bending over them like auroras that had forgotten which way was up. He sat up slowly, feeling the pull of gravity again. His body didn't ache anymore. It felt light, untethered. The air was cool but not cold. And for the first time since he'd arrived in the forgotten dimension, it smelled like something familiar, earth after rain. That simple scent made his chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much he missed the small human smells of living things. He stood and looked around. The endless field of Ricks was gone. The observatory, the streams, the fractured clock, all had dissolved into the soft horizon. In their place was an open plain of pale grass that shimmered faintly with light. The stars above were lower, almost close enough to touch, and they flickered with slow rhythm, as though they were listening to his heartbeat. He started walking. The ground felt real now, solid beneath his boots. Each step left a faint mark that lingered for a few seconds before fading away, as though the world was remembering him gently, without clinging. He didn't know where he was going, but there was no fear in the uncertainty. The stillness was kind, guiding him by instinct rather than logic. After a while, he saw something moving in the distance, a figure, small and almost luminous, walking toward him. For a moment, he thought it might be the girl again, or maybe another reflection of himself. But as the figure drew closer, Rick realized it was someone else entirely. A boy, no older than 10, barefoot, his hair wild and silver like starlight. He wore a small cloak that shimmered as he moved, and in his hand he held a sphere of glowing sand that trickled endlessly between his fingers. When he finally stopped a few feet away, he smiled, wide and honest, the kind of smile Rick hadn't seen in lifetimes. "You're awake," the boy said. His voice carried the softness of echo, the way dreams sometimes speak before fading. Rick studied him carefully. "Guess I am," he said. "Where's here this time? Some kind of post-epiphany daycare?" The boy laughed lightly. "Not quite. This is what's left after the noise." Rick frowned, looking around again. "You mean the dimension?" "No," the boy said, crouching to let the sand pour onto the ground. "I mean you. This is what's left of you." The words hit like a slow wave. Rick didn't answer right away. He glanced down at his hands, flexing them. They looked solid, but he could see faint light beneath the skin, soft veins of blue and gold pulsing in rhythm with his breath. "So," he said finally, voice quieter, "I'm dead?" The boy tilted his head. "Does that word even mean anything anymore?" Rick smirked faintly. "Guess not." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the world around them. The boy scooped up some of the glowing sand again, letting it run between his fingers. "Every Rick who comes here leaves something behind," he said. "Most forget to look at what they've kept." Rick folded his arms, watching the grains dissolve into mist. "And what's your deal, kid? You some cosmic janitor cleaning up what's left of me?" The boy smiled again, patient. "Something like that. I'm what you used to be, before the inventions, before the portals, before the running." Rick blinked, studying him closely. "You mean, you're me?" The boy nodded. "The part you buried so deep you forgot it existed." For a long time, Rick said nothing. His mind, that part of it that still wanted to categorize, to label, to reason, tried to fit this into a framework, but it couldn't. This wasn't science. It wasn't even memory. It was something older, something that had existed before logic began to divide the world into what could be explained and what couldn't. He sank down onto the grass beside the boy, exhaling softly. "So what happens now?" The boy picked up a handful of sand again and blew it into the wind. The grains drifted upward, glowing brighter, forming shapes that hovered for a few moments before fading. Rick watched as faces appeared, not just his, but others. Morty, Summer, Beth, even Jerry, awkward and small but smiling. "They're not here," the boy said. "But they remember you. Every version of them does. That's what memory really is, the universe keeping little pieces of us alive in others." Rick felt something twist inside him. Not pain, not regret, but a quiet ache of recognition. He reached out toward one of the glowing faces, but it vanished before he could touch it. "I never really said goodbye," he murmured. "You never had to," the boy replied. "You just had to stop trying to escape it." The air shimmered again. In the distance, a river of light appeared, winding through the horizon like liquid glass. It pulsed gently, drawing the stars closer. The boy stood, motioning for Rick to follow. "Come on," he said. There's one last thing to see. Rick hesitated, then rose, brushing the faint starlight from his coat. They walked together in silence toward the river. As they approached, Rick could hear a faint melody, something like humming mixed with wind. It was simple, soothing, almost familiar. When they reached the bank, the boy stopped and gestured toward the flowing current. Inside the river were moments, tiny, shimmering fragments of life. Rick saw himself laughing with Morty over a broken experiment, sitting beside Beth when she was small, looking up at the stars from a roof long since forgotten. He saw mistakes too, harsh words, empty bottles, nights filled with regret. Yet even those moments glowed softly, touched by the same forgiveness that filled the air here. "This is everything you ever were," the boy said. "Every choice, every version, every memory, all flowing toward the same place." Rick stared into the current. The reflections moved slowly, folding into one another, becoming indistinguishable. "And what's that place?" he asked quietly. The boy's eyes softened, where all stories go when they're finally done being told. Rick didn't speak. He just watched the river for a long time, the hum of it seeping into his bones. Then he knelt, dipping his hand into the current. The light was warm and it didn't resist him. He could feel it. All of it. The chaos, the brilliance, the loneliness, the love. It wasn't heavy anymore. It just was. When he looked up again, the boy was standing a few steps away, fading slightly, edges turning transparent. "You don't need me anymore," he said. Rick's throat tightened. "Guess not," he said softly. "But I'm glad you showed up anyway." The boy smiled one last time, the same bright, unbroken smile that belonged to the part of Rick that had once believed in the wonder of things. "You always find your way home," he whispered. And then he was gone, scattered into the air, like dust returning to the stars. Rick stayed by the river, watching the flow until he could no longer tell where the light ended and the mist began. The hum grew softer, slower. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth sink deeper into him. Above, the stars shifted again, drawing closer until they blurred into one continuous glow. The whole sky looked like a heartbeat, pulsing gently, endlessly. Rick exhaled, the sound small but full. "All right, universe," he murmured. "I get it." And as the river carried its light into the horizon, Rick followed it, not walking, not floating, but simply becoming part of the quiet flow. Somewhere in 1,000 worlds, someone whispered his name. Somewhere, a version of him laughed again. Somewhere, the story kept moving. But here, in the forgotten place where silence met infinity, Rick simply rested, and for once that was enough. Light. It was not blinding, nor was it comforting. It was infinite. Rick drifted within it, formless, yet aware of himself in ways he'd never been before. Time had dissolved completely now, leaving behind only the pulse of the universe. It was a soundless rhythm, ancient and vast, and it moved through him like breath through lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. For a while there was peace, pure, unbroken, crystalline. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. Not from outside him, but from within. A sky unfolded, deep violet streaked with gold. Beneath it, an ocean rose from nothing, rippling softly as if it had always been waiting for him. The surface glowed faintly with the reflection of 2 moons. And as Rick gazed down, he saw his own face ripple across the water, then fragment into 1,000 pieces that floated away like ash. He stepped forward, and the ocean held him as if it were solid ground. Each step sent circles of light outward, and in each circle an image formed, memories, like thin sheets of glass. There was Morty stumbling through a portal, his terrified face morphing into determination. There was Beth, her eyes glistening as she whispered something Rick couldn't quite hear. There was Bird Person. There was Unity. There were the countless Ricks he had outlived, outsmarted, outdrunk, all of them suspended in time, bound together by some invisible thread. Rick exhaled. "I thought I was done with all this," he muttered. A voice answered, distant yet familiar. "Stories don't end, they echo." He turned, and standing at the edge of the luminous horizon was a figure cloaked in shadow. Unlike the boy, this one had weight, the kind of presence that bent the air around it. Its face was hidden, but its outline flickered like a glitch in the fabric of existence. "Who are you supposed to be?" Rick asked, his tone steady but his pulse quickening. The figure tilted its head. "I am what remains when a mind tries to forget itself." Rick gave a humorless chuckle. "So, another version of me, huh? What is this now? The multiversal therapy finale?" The figure didn't move closer, but the light dimmed slightly around it. "You always needed to laugh before looking," it said. "But this isn't therapy. This is truth." Rick crossed his arms. "All right then. Enlighten me. What truth am I supposed to see this time? The figure's voice softened, yet it carried through the ocean like thunder under glass. But everything you've built, every escape, every genius solution was a distraction from the simplest thing you feared. Rick frowned, and that is. The shadow's edges rippled, and suddenly, the reflection on the ocean changed. Rick saw himself, younger, sitting in a dimly lit garage surrounded by unfinished inventions. His hands were trembling, not from alcohol but from grief. Next to him was a small photograph, his wife, holding Beth as a baby. He remembered this night. The night he stopped looking for comfort and started building walls, made of science and arrogance. You built universes to avoid feeling this, the figure said quietly. You broke infinity to avoid one loss. Rick's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, but the words refused to form. He'd spent lifetimes pretending he'd transcended emotion, that intellect was armor enough. Yet seeing himself now, stripped bare, it all looked so small. The gadgets, the equations, the bravado, all of it was scaffolding over a wound he never let heal. The figure stepped closer, its face beginning to take shape, not identical to his, but carved from the same essence. You call yourself a realist, it said, but you've spent eternity denying the most real thing of all, that love doesn't die just because bodies do. Rick's eyes flickered. Love's a chemical illusion, he muttered. Neurotransmitters, attachment conditioning, survival bias. The figure smiled faintly. Then why does it still hurt when you remember her? The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Rick's jaw clenched, and his gaze dropped back to the water. His reflection wavered between faces. The cynic, the scientist, the wanderer, the broken man. Because it's all I had left, he said finally, his voice barely audible, and I let it go. The figure nodded. You didn't let it go. You buried it under invention. But even the smartest mind cannot outbuild its own heart. Rick looked up again, the faintest shimmer of tears in his eyes. Not from sadness, but from the unbearable clarity of truth. So what now, he asked. You expect me to forgive myself? Move on? Become cosmic stardust and join the great kumbaya? The figure's form began to dissolve, its voice echoing like fading thunder. Not forgiveness, just understanding. You are not being punished. You are being remembered by the universe, by every version of yourself that ever tried to be better. The light around him began to change again, folding inward. The ocean trembled and the stars above rearranged themselves into a spiral, pulling everything toward a center point of blinding white. The figure's last words came as a whisper, carried on the current. Step forward, Rick. The end isn't the end. It's the part where you finally see. Rick hesitated only a second before stepping into the spiral. Instantly, everything shifted. The water fell away. The horizon collapsed into a single beam of light. And then he was standing, not drifting, not dreaming. Standing in a room he knew better than any other. His garage. It was quiet almost exactly as he'd left it. Tools scattered across the workbench. Portal gun disassembled. A faint smell of burnt circuitry mixed with whiskey. But there was something different. The air hummed, faintly alive like the whole space was breathing. He walked to the table and ran a finger along the metal surface. Of course, he muttered. Can't escape my own creation, even in whatever afterlife this is. Then he saw it, a small notebook lying open in the center of the bench. His handwriting filled the page, but the words weren't formulas or schematics. They were sentences, simple ones. She laughed when the toaster burned. Beth's first word was starlight. Morty reminds me of myself, when I still believed. He sat down slowly, flipping through the pages. There were hundreds of lines like that, small, tender moments from every life, every version, every failure and triumph. They weren't inventions, they were memories. The things he never said out loud, the things he'd convinced himself didn't matter. Rick exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. So that's it, he whispered. All that running, and it was always this. A faint sound made him turn, the creak of the garage door. Light spilled in, golden and warm. Silhouetted in it was a figure, not Morty, not Beth, not anyone he'd expect. It was the boy again, barefoot, smiling softly. You came back, Rick said. The boy nodded. You never really left. Rick looked down at the notebook one last time, then stood. So what happens if I walk through that door? The boy stepped aside, the sunlight spilling wider. Then you wake up. Rick's brow furrowed. Wake up? I thought this was waking up. The boy shook his head, eyes gleaming. No, this was remembering. The waking comes next. Rick stood there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the threshold. The light beyond it was neither frightening nor inviting. It simply was. He took a deep breath, feeling something unclench inside him that had been tight for lifetimes. Then he smiled, Small, weary, but real. All right then, he said softly. Let's see what's on the other side. He walked forward, the soles of his boots clicking against the concrete, each step lighter than the last. As he reached the door, the light grew so bright it erased the walls, the tools, even the air itself. For a heartbeat, he turned back, half expecting the boy to follow, but he was already fading, becoming part of the glow. Rick stepped through, and for the first time in all the infinite versions of himself that had ever existed, he didn't look back. There was music in the dark. It was faint at first, like a hum leaking through the walls of sleep, a rhythm that didn't belong to any machine but came from the spaces between them. Rick opened his eyes slowly, expecting nothing, yet finding himself once again in the garage, the same one but softer now, as though the edges of the world had been sanded down. The lights overhead flickered in time with the hum, glowing in warm pulses instead of harsh fluorescence. Every tool, every circuit, every forgotten invention on the shelves seemed alive, resonating gently with the same sound. He sat up from where he'd fallen asleep on the floor. The portal gun lay beside him, half assembled, its metal gleaming with a subtle inner glow. "Guess you're still singing," he murmured, voice hoarse from dreams. "Or maybe I'm finally hearing." The machines around him shifted in tone, a chorus of quiet, mechanical sighs. The air carried a slow vibration, a harmony that pressed against his chest. It was like the garage itself had begun to breathe. Rick ran his hand along the workbench, fingertips tracing over the scratches carved by years of restless invention. For once, he didn't feel the urge to fix, to build, to improve. He just listened. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hum of a quantum stabilizer, the drip of a half-sealed flask, the whisper of circuits resting in sleep. It was imperfect, dissonant, yet somehow whole. Rick closed his eyes, letting it wash through him. He realized, with a flicker of unease, that it sounded almost human, like a choir remembering how to weep. He stood, the floor creaking softly under his boots, and began walking through the space. Dust hung in golden sheets where the dim light touched. Shelves of forgotten prototypes lined the walls. Devices meant to erase grief, to bend time, to outsmart loneliness. All of them silent now, but not dead. He paused before one, a small cube of cracked glass filled with faintly glowing dust. He couldn't remember what it was for. The label had faded, leaving only the impression of a name, something like Solus Engine. Rick lifted it gently, and the hum changed. A low note trembled through the floor, wrapping around him like a heartbeat. The cube flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw something inside, a memory, or maybe an illusion, a kitchen table, laughter, the smell of burnt toast, Beth's voice saying something about starlight. He blinked hard. The image vanished, but the sound stayed, a melody forming from the hum, simple and warm. "You remember too, huh?" he whispered to the machine. "Guess I wasn't the only one running." A soft crackle filled the air. The garage door trembled slightly, then opened just enough to let in a thin line of light. Dust swirled in it like tiny galaxies. Rick squinted, setting the cube down carefully. He walked toward the door, the music following him like a shadow. Outside was not the meadow he remembered. It had changed again. Or maybe it had never been the same twice. The field stretched endlessly, painted in blues and silvers, every blade of grass humming faintly in tune with the machines. Above him, the sky shimmered with slow-moving shapes, not stars, but fragments of other worlds, suspended like lanterns in water. He stepped outside, the cool air curling against his skin. The hum deepened, growing into something almost symphonic. He realized it wasn't the machines that had started it. It was the world itself. The field, the light, the wind brushing past him. Everything here sang, and the melody, he noticed, wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same tune his wife used to hum while fixing Beth's hair in the mornings. The same rhythm that used to echo faintly through their home, weaving through the scent of coffee and burnt toast. Rick froze, breath catching. The memory hit like sunlight through fog. He'd forgotten how much sound could feel like love. He took a few more steps, boots sinking into the soft earth. The grass responded to his movement, bending toward him, glowing faintly at his touch. Every few paces, a faint vibration rippled out, like the planet acknowledging him. Rick tilted his head, half expecting someone to appear. "All right, universe," he muttered. "What are you trying to tell me now?" There was no answer, only the faint rise of the melody, yet it was enough. He followed it, across the field, down to a quiet hollow where the sound grew clearer. There at the center stood a shape. It wasn't a machine this time, nor a reflection of himself. It was a small, rusted speaker perched atop a smooth stone, the kind of old earth relic that didn't belong in any advanced dimension. Rick crouched down. The speaker crackled, and through it came a voice. Hi, this is, me, Rick, or one of me. If you're hearing this, then I guess the machines woke up again. Rick's heart stuttered. The voice was his own, older, raspier, but undeniably him. The recording continued. I built this place to rest, the voice said softly. Not for my body. That part doesn't matter. For my thoughts. Every invention, every mistake, every universe I left unfinished. I stored them here. I thought maybe if I turned them into something peaceful, they'd stop haunting me. A long pause. The hum wove around the silence like wind through tall grass. But turns out, the voice added, you can't just turn guilt into beauty. You have to live with it. You have to listen until it stops sounding like punishment and starts sounding like memory. Rick exhaled slowly, the words sinking deep. I know you're tired, the recording went on. I know what it's like to run until there's nowhere left to go. So if you're here, if you're me, stop. Just stop. Sit down. Let it sing. That's what this place was for. The speaker clicked softly, then fell silent. The melody continued on its own, carried by the air. Rick stayed crouched for a long while, staring at the device. Then, almost without realizing it, he sat down beside it. The ground was cool, damp with dew. He leaned back against the stone and closed his eyes. The music rose around him again, fragments of his past reshaping into something new. The hum of engines, the laughter of family, the soft static of an old radio, all of it melted together, becoming the same quiet rhythm. He thought of Morty then. The version who had stayed behind. The boy who'd stopped asking questions and simply existed, tending the garden, watching the horizon. Rick wondered if he was still here somewhere. Another echo, another song in this strange harmony. The melody swelled, then softened. Rick felt it in his chest, now steady and warm. He could almost believe that every machine he'd ever built, every reckless idea had been leading to this, a moment where he could finally stop inventing and simply be. He opened his eyes once more. The sky had shifted to twilight, painted in slow-moving colors, lavender, rose, gold. The fragments above him glowed brighter, drifting closer. Each one carried faint images within, not universes this time, but moments. Morty's nervous smile, Beth's proud eyes, 1,000 quiet evenings lost to ambition. They surrounded him like fireflies. Rick reached up and one of them settled gently on his palm. Inside he saw the garage again, but this time it wasn't empty. Morty was there, sitting on the floor, tinkering with something small and glowing. He looked peaceful. Rick smiled faintly. Good, he whispered. Stay there, kid. Keep it going. The fragment pulsed once, then drifted upward, joining the rest in the endless dark. Rick lay back fully now, hands behind his head. The hum of the machines merged with the rhythm of his breath. Everything felt aligned. The world, the sound, the silence. And for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel the need to understand it. The melody played on, low and steady, like a heartbeat that had been waiting ages to be heard. The machines were singing to him, or maybe he was singing through them. It didn't matter anymore. He let his eyes close, the light washing over his face. The air was warm, the world was humming, and somewhere beyond the edge of memory, the forgotten Ricks of every timeline joined in, their songs rising softly into the infinite. And Rick, the last one still awake, smiled. Then, quietly, beautifully, he slept. When Rick woke, the light was soft and gold, pouring through an unseen window that didn't exist the night before. The music had quieted to a low vibration, more like a memory of a song than the song itself. Dust motes hung suspended in the stillness, each one glowing faintly, as though every particle remembered the melody that had passed through it. For a long while he didn't move. The silence felt sacred, not empty, but full in a way that made movement feel intrusive. Eventually, he sat up. His joints ached faintly, though the pain carried no weight. He'd grown used to this place. The field that changed, the garage that returned, the machines that hummed like dreaming children. But this morning something felt different. The air itself seemed to hold an expectation, as if waiting for him to notice something important. On the floor beside him was a small envelope. It hadn't been there before. It was sealed with a faint blue wax, the imprint of a gear pressed into its surface, one of his own designs years out of use. Rick picked it up slowly, his fingers trembling just a little. The paper felt warm. He broke the seal. Inside was a folded page, covered in handwriting, his own, but the words were gentler than his usual scrawl. The lines neat, patient. The ink shimmered faintly, catching the light. He read it aloud, voice low as though afraid to disturb the quiet. To whichever me wakes up next. There's something I never built, and it's been haunting me more than anything else. Not a machine, Not a portal, a bridge between all the versions of us that forgot how to speak to each other. I don't mean the Ricks across timelines, I mean the ones inside. The young one who dreamed, the old one who lost, the one who keeps fixing, the one who finally stopped. They've all been shouting over each other for too long. Maybe it's time we listened instead. Rick paused. The handwriting wavered slightly near the end, as though written by a tired hand. So here's what I'm asking, right? Just once. Not equations, not blueprints. Words. Tell the ones you hurt what you couldn't when you had the chance. It doesn't matter if they hear it. The universe always does. It was signed simply Rick C-137 or whoever I am now. Rick lowered the letter slowly. Around him the air shimmered as if in agreement. He exhaled through his nose long and steady. All right, old man, he muttered. Let's see if I can remember how to talk without equations. He found an old notebook on the workbench, not the one filled with memories, but blank. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. A pen sat beside it, half buried under a coil of wire. He picked it up, sat down, and waited. For a moment, the words refused to come. His hand hovered above the page, motionless. Then, as if released by a slow, turning gear, he began to write. Dear Morty! The ink flowed softly, pooling at the curves of each letter. I never told you this, but you reminded me of me, not the drunk, not the cynic, but the kid who thought the stars were something he could reach if he just stretched far enough. I used to be proud of that in you. Then I got scared, because every time I looked at you, I saw the part of myself I'd buried so deep I forgot it existed, and I didn't know how to handle that, so I pushed you away. I made jokes. I made excuses. I made universes. Anything to avoid admitting that I loved you in the only way I knew how, by keeping you close but pretending not to care. He stopped to breathe, his chest tightening. The pen shook slightly in his hand. He forced himself to keep going. If you're out there somewhere, I hope you found peace before I did. I hope you learned to forgive faster than I ever could. I hope you still look at the stars and see wonder, not equations. And if by some glitch in time you ever hear this, just know, kid, I was always proud of you, even when I didn't say it, especially then. He set the pen down, hand trembling. For a few seconds, he just sat there, staring at the words until they blurred. Then he turned the page. Dear Beth, you deserved a father who stayed, not one who vanished into theories and timelines. I told myself I left to protect you, but the truth is, I left because I couldn't stand to see myself reflected in your eyes. You loved me without needing to understand me, and I didn't know how to handle love that pure. I called it weakness. It wasn't. It was strength, the kind I never learned. He paused, biting the inside of his cheek. If you ever find this, I hope you remember the mornings, the smell of coffee, the way your mom used to hum. Those were real, even if I wasn't. And if I ever show up again, another version, another mistake, tell him he doesn't have to run anymore. He turned another page. The rhythm became easier, softer. The words no longer hurt as much to write. They flowed like the hum of the machine, steady and alive. Dear Diane. He froze. Her name had not left his lips in decades. Just seeing it on the page felt like opening a door long rusted shut. His breath caught. I used to tell myself that I lost you because the universe was cruel. That fate picked me out for punishment. But the truth is, I lost you because I never stopped chasing the impossible. I thought if I could just understand everything, I'd never have to feel anything. But understanding doesn't hold you at night. Equations don't laugh. I miss the sound of your voice in the dark. I miss how you used to touch my face when I was lost in thought, pulling me back to earth. His eyes burned. The ink smudged beneath his hand. You'd laugh if you saw me now, sitting in a garage, talking to ghosts, writing to people who can't hear me. But I think that's what love becomes after death. Echoes that refuse to fade. I hope you're somewhere quiet, somewhere warm, and I hope you forgive me, even if I can't yet. He signed her name beneath the letters curling gently. Rick leaned back, the pen falling from his hand. The notebook lay open before him, the words glowing faintly in the dim light. The machines around him had gone completely still, not silent, but listening. He could feel it, the air vibrating with the weight of his words, as if the dimension itself was absorbing them. The pages rustled once, though there was no wind. Then the ink shimmered, lifted slightly from the paper, and dissolved into a fine mist that drifted upward, vanishing through the ceiling like smoke. Rick exhaled, almost a laugh. Guess that's one way to send mail across realities. The human returned, gentle, melodic, wrapping around him like an embrace. It wasn't mechanical. Now it was alive. Every word he'd written seemed to echo back to him, reformed into sound. A voice that wasn't his whispered softly, fragments of his own letters turned into lullabies. He stood, watching the mist swirl through the air. The world outside glowed brighter. Through the open door, he could see the horizon, endless and gold stretching into eternity. For a moment, he thought he saw figures there. A child waving, a woman smiling, shapes he knew, and shapes he only dreamed. The hum deepened. The machines flickered in response, each one lighting up, one after another, until the whole garage pulsed with a heartbeat of light. Rick smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You sentimental bastards," he whispered to the universe. He walked to the doorway. The field beyond was alive with motion. Waves of golden grass swaying in time with the hum, stars drifting lazily in the day sky. The notebook still lay behind him, glowing softly, pages empty again, as if waiting for another letter. Rick looked once more, eyes tired but peaceful. "Yeah," he murmured. "Think they heard me." He stepped out into the light, the hum fading into the distance, leaving only the echo of a heartbeat, quiet, steady, eternal. The machines watched him go, and when the last of his footsteps faded, the notebook on the workbench closed itself. A final spark of ink shimmered on its cover. One word. "Remember." The golden light dimmed as Rick stepped farther into the field, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The hum behind him faded to silence, replaced by a strange quiet that felt almost alive. The ground shimmered beneath his boots. Each step left a faint ripple in the air, as if he were walking on the surface of a memory rather than soil. He turned once, expecting to see the garage, but it was gone, and its place was only an expanse of shifting grass that seemed to breathe, moving with the rhythm of something vast beneath. For the first time in a long while, Rick felt a flicker of unease. The air here smelled faintly of static and rain, not the scent of a storm, but the kind of rain that exists in dreams, always about to fall but never arriving. He took a deep breath and kept walking. The world grew stranger as he moved forward. The light bent, casting shadows that didn't belong to him. The sky pulsed faintly, rhythmically, like the slow beat of a cosmic heart. Every few steps, fragments of sound drifted by, laughter, whispers, the echo of his own voice from lifetimes ago. He didn't know if they were real or just the universe playing back the echoes of all his choices. After a while, the terrain changed. The grass gave way to glass, smooth, reflective, impossibly thin. Beneath its surface, entire galaxies seemed to swirl, their light bending and folding into infinity. Rick crouched, touching it carefully. It felt warm. When he leaned closer, his reflection stared back. Not the weary old face he'd grown used to, but versions of himself from other timelines. One smirked, confident and cruel. Another looked hollow, eyes sunken from regret. A younger one stared upward with the same burning curiosity that had once driven him to tear apart the universe. Each reflection moved independently, living out its own story within the mirrored world. Rick stared for a long time, saying nothing. Then one of the reflections, the one with tired human eyes, looked directly at him and spoke. "You shouldn't have come this far," it said, voice low and identical to his own. "There's nothing ahead worth finding." Rick tilted his head. "That's what I said before every discovery I ever made." The reflection smiled sadly. "And look where that got us." For a heartbeat, neither moved, and the glass beneath him rippled, swallowing the image whole. The galaxies beneath flared bright, and a deep vibration rolled through the air, not threatening, but calling. Rick straightened. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's see what you want to show me." He continued walking. The mirrored plane stretched on, infinite and silent. With every step, images rose beneath his feet. Scenes from his life, flickering like old film reels. Morty's laugh, Beth's glare, Diane's face caught in the moment before she vanished forever. The sight twisted something in his chest, but he didn't look away. The further he walked, the clearer the visions became, until they surrounded him completely, suspended like holograms in the air. Each one whispered fragments of words, moments frozen in time, arguments, laughter, silence. Then through the shifting light, a doorway appeared. It was small, wooden, out of place in the cosmic expanse. No walls surrounded it. It stood alone, humming softly, the same note that had followed him from the garage. Rick approached slowly, his pulse quickened. The closer he came, the more he felt it, that subtle pull, the quiet gravity of something familiar. He placed a hand on the door. It was warm. When he opened it, the universe fell away. He stood in his old home. The lights were low. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and oil, the scent of his early experiments. On the counter sat a small music box. Diane's, the same one that used to play every morning before she'd hum along. His throat tightened. "Not again," he whispered. "Not this." But the scene continued anyway. The air shimmered, and suddenly she was there, sitting by the window. hair catching the sunlight, reading something he couldn't see. She looked alive, real. The sight was so precise it hurt. "Diane," he said, voice cracking slightly. She looked up, smiling, not at him, but through him, like a memory replaying itself. "You'll miss breakfast again," she said softly, the same tone she'd used 1,000 times before. Rick took a step closer. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The image flickered. She didn't respond. Her hand reached for the coffee cup that wasn't there. The moment repeated, seamless and perfect, an endless loop of what he'd lost. He dropped to his knees, gripping the edge of the counter. "Please," he murmured. "Just once. Hear me." For the briefest instant, she stopped moving. The cup froze midair. Her head turned slightly toward him, her eyes locking on his. There was no sound, just a silence that felt infinite. Then she spoke, her voice faint but clear. "Rick," she said, "you can't fix everything." And then she was gone. The kitchen dissolved into starlight, the floor beneath him falling away. He was floating again, weightless, surrounded by the hum that had haunted him for so long. He drifted through it, eyes closed. The sound changed, deepening into a chord that seemed to pulse with meaning. He felt it not in his ears, but in his bones. It was the sound of every life he'd touched, every mistake, every fragment of love, every echo of himself scattered across infinity. "All right," he said quietly to the void. "You win. What now?" The light around him coalesced into a shape, faint flickering. It wasn't Diane this time, or Morty, or Beth. It was him, the reflection from the glass plane, older now, eyes gentler, almost peaceful. The figure spoke softly. "Now you stop running." Rick laughed, a dry, bitter sound that turned into something softer by the end. "Running's kind of my thing." "Not anymore," said the other Rick. "You've already arrived." The light brightened. The hum grew louder, rising to a trembling crescendo that filled everything. Memories unfolded around him like blooming flowers, moments from every life, every reality. Smell of ozone from his first portal, the laughter of 1,000 Mortys, the silence of a universe he once thought he'd destroyed. Then the light dimmed again, condensing into a single point in the distance. A doorway of pure white. Rick stared at it. His chest felt heavy. "And if I go through..." The reflection smiled faintly. "You stop being everything and start being something again." Rick frowned. "That sounds like dying." "Maybe it's just remembering what being alive really meant." For a long moment, Rick said nothing. Then he sighed and turned toward the light. "Guess it's about time I learned that lesson." He walked forward. Each step felt lighter. The hum softened, becoming a melody, not mechanical now, but human. The sound of laughter, tears, and something deeper, forgiveness. As he neared the doorway, he hesitated once more and looked back. Behind him stretched the mirrored plane, the fragments of his life scattered like starlight, the garage, the letters, the faces, all glowing faintly, like constellations marking his path. He smiled faintly. "Don't wait up," he whispered to them. Then he stepped through. The world went silent. For a moment there was only darkness, not cold or empty, but vast and peaceful. Then far off a faint sound began, a heartbeat, steady and calm, the first breath of a new beginning. And as it echoed, the word that had been written on the closed notebook far behind him flickered once more across the void. "Remember." It pulsed gently, then faded, leaving only the hum of creation beginning again. Somewhere, beyond space and memory, light bloomed anew, and the universe exhaled. He opened his eyes slowly, as though waking from the longest sleep in creation. There was no ceiling above him, no walls to contain him, only an endless expanse of pale light that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. Rick sat up, unsure if he was standing or floating. If this was air or a memory, the hum that had guided him through every layer of existence was softer now, almost a lullaby. It wasn't a place anymore. It was peace shaped into something he could finally recognize. The air shimmered. Fragments of his past drifted nearby like slow-moving constellations, Morty's voice echoing with a joke that never reached its punchline, Beth's laughter ringing through a backyard long gone, the flicker of portals and galaxies spinning backward into nothingness. They moved like lanterns released into a calm river, fading into the soft horizon. He didn't speak at first. The silence was comforting in a way he hadn't known in centuries. No machines whirring, no universes collapsing under the weight of his curiosity. No versions of himself arguing across time, just the simple rhythm of existing, of breathing without reason. "Guess this is it," he murmured at last. His voice carried, folding and unfolding across the light, echoing back with a tenderness he didn't expect. Then somewhere in the distance, a voice replied. "Not quite." He turned. Standing there, if standing even meant anything in this place, was Morty, or something that looked like him. Younger, lighter, eyes clearer than the real ones had ever been. The boy smiled faintly. You always think things end before they do, Morty said. But endings don't really stick with you, do they? Rick frowned, though there was no sharpness in it. You're not real, he said quietly. Morty shrugged. Maybe not, but neither are you. Not here. Rick took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the horizon again. The light rippled, carrying faint shadows of old memories. The Citadel, the screaming Ricks, the weight of infinite mistakes. They were fading, dissolving into nothing. So what is this then? Afterlife? Simulation? Morty shook his head gently. You called it the forgotten dimension once. Maybe this is what happens when someone finally remembers it. Rick smiled faintly. Cute. You sound wiser than usual. Maybe you finally decided to listen. There was something almost sacred about the stillness between them. The light around them dimmed slightly, becoming golden, like late afternoon sun filtering through curtains. It made Morty's features softer, more human. Rick looked at him, or the idea of him, and felt something he hadn't in ages ease. I kept trying to fix it, Rick said after a while. Every timeline, every version of me, thought if I could figure out the right formula, the right decision, I could make it all mean something. Morty tilted his head. And did you? Rick chuckled, low and rough. No, turns out, meaning doesn't like being solved. The boy smiled. You taught me that once. I taught you a lot of things that shouldn't be repeated, Rick muttered. Maybe, but you also taught me how to look at the stars and not feel small. Rick looked up. The stars here were strange, more like thoughts than suns. They pulsed softly, fading in and out with the rhythm of memory. I guess I wanted you to see what I saw, he said quietly. The beauty in it all, even when it hurts. Morty nodded. You did. It's why we followed you, even when we didn't understand. For a while, they stood together in silence, surrounded by a universe that was no longer cruel or infinite, just quiet. Rick felt the familiar itch to analyze it, to build something from it, but the urge passed quickly. For once, curiosity wasn't a burden. He looked back at Morty. You know, I always thought I was running from grief, from her, from the things I broke. But I think I was just afraid of stopping. That's what you do, Morty said. You run, you build, you destroy. But when you stop, he smiled softly. You remember. Rick closed his eyes. The word lingered like an echo through the vastness. Remember. When he opened them again, Morty was gone. In his place, the light had shifted. It was dusk now, or something like it. Shadows stretched long and soft across the ground. Though there was no source for them, the hum returned, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of something enormous and kind. He walked forward. With each step, the world around him changed. The light dimmed to a twilight blue. Shapes began to form. Outlines of familiar things. A workbench. A telescope. A single mug with a crack down its side. Then faintly the sound of rain. It wasn't coming from above, but from memory itself. Soft and cleansing. He reached a clearing. There, sitting cross-legged beneath a tree that seemed to grow from pure starlight, was Diane. Her back was turned to him, hair gently moving with the unseen wind. Rick stopped several feet away, afraid that moving closer might shatter the illusion. She spoke before he could. You made it farther than I thought you would. He swallowed. You always did underestimate me. She laughed to sound like a sigh folded into joy. No, I just knew how long it would take you to forgive yourself. Rick stepped closer. That's assuming I did. You did enough, she said, turning slightly to face him. Her eyes were warm, clearer than any version of her he'd ever recreated. It's all this place ever asked of you. He wanted to say something clever, something sharp, to hide the tremor in his voice. But all that came out was, I missed you. I know, she said simply. But you never really lost me, did you? You carried me in every equation, every failure, every quiet moment when you couldn't sleep. Rick chuckled weakly. You sound like a hallucination. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm what's left when you stop pretending you're alone. They stood together under the starlit tree for a long time. The leaves shimmered faintly, catching fragments of their memories like raindrops, first dates, small arguments, laughter, silence, all the quiet moments between the chaos. Rick finally sat beside her. What happens now? Diane looked up, eyes reflecting the glowing constellations above. You rest, she said. You let go of the weight. You stop being everything, and you let yourself just be. He exhaled slowly. And if I can't? She smiled, brushing invisible dust from her palms. Then you'll stay here until you can. Time doesn't move in this place, Rick. It just breathes. They sat together as the light dimmed even further, until the stars became lanterns floating across a darkened sea. The hum faded into the rhythm of their breathing. After a while, she reached out and took his hand. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple, human gesture. He looked at her fingers intertwined with his and felt something unclench inside him. "You always thought the universe was a puzzle," she whispered, "but it was just a song. You were always too busy solving it to hear it." Rick laughed softly, tears catching in his voice. "Yeah, classic me." The stars began to drift upward, rising slowly like glowing petals. One by one, they vanished into the darkness, leaving only a faint silvery haze. The starlit tree began to dissolve too, its light spreading through the air. "Diane." She looked at him one last time. "You did your best," she said. "That's all you ever had to do." Her voice faded into the hum, and then she was gone. Not vanished, but blended into the light itself. Rick sat there for a long while, his head bowed, the silence deep enough to fill galaxies. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe that's enough." He stood slowly. The air shimmered once more, the starlight folding around him like a gentle wave. The hum returned, softer than ever, and for the first time in 1,000 lives it sounded like peace. And somewhere in the distance, faint and almost playful, a familiar voice echoed, "Hey, Rick, ready for one last adventure?" Rick smiled. "Yeah, Morty," he whispered. "Let's go home." The light folded in around him, warm and eternal, and the forgotten dimension exhaled one final time. The hum became a breeze. The breeze became a whisper. And then the whisper became a heartbeat. Soft, steady, impossibly human. Rick drifted through it, eyes closed, weightless between two worlds. There was no direction here, no gravity to guide him. Only that rhythm, as if the universe itself were breathing him back into existence. Light gathered again, not the blinding kind he'd grown used to, but a tender radiance that felt almost like sunrise. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a place that wasn't quite real yet, shapes forming slowly, as if painted by a sleepy god. The sky was a gentle lavender, the air smelled faintly of grass after rain. And before him stretched a familiar sight, the smith's backyard. The picnic table was there, the half-broken fence, even the sound of wind chimes that he hadn't heard in years. But everything shimmered faintly translucent, as though balanced between memory and creation. Rick took a step forward. His boots didn't crunch against dirt. They made no sound at all. He reached for the table and his hand passed through it, rippling the image like water. He frowned softly. "Figures," he murmured. "Even paradise can't handle me touching stuff." Then from somewhere nearby he heard laughter, light, familiar, real. He turned. Morty was running across the yard, chasing Summer with a half-deflated beach ball, both of them shouting nonsense. Beth sat on the porch, smiling faintly, and even Jerry, was grilling something that might have been edible for once. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't quite a dream. It was the life he'd always watched from the outside, now replaying without him needing to fix or break it. He watched for a while, hands in his pockets, the hum of existence blending with their laughter. It wasn't bittersweet anymore. It was calm. "Don't just stand there, old man." The voice made him turn. Morty stood behind him, not the ghostly one from before, but the real Morty, or maybe the version he remembered best. A little older, a little more certain. His grin was small but warm. Rick raised an eyebrow. "You again. What? The multiverse run out of people to haunt me with." Morty shook his head. "You're not being haunted. You're being invited." "Invited? To what?" Morty gestured toward the yard. "To stay a while." Rick looked back at the scene. "Doesn't look like there's a seat for me." "There always was," Morty said quietly. "You just never sat down." Rick chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, well, that's because I was too busy keeping the damn seat from catching fire." Morty stepped closer, studying him the way Rick used to study equations. "You really think that was your job, to keep everything from breaking?" Rick shrugged. "It's what I'm good at." "No," Morty said softly. "You were good at finding beauty in the broken." The words lingered between them, soft as starlight. Rick looked at him for a long time, his eyes searching the boy's face. Not for logic or proof, but for the truth he'd never let himself hear. Then slowly, Rick sat down on the edge of the spectral table. It rippled beneath him but held. The scene flickered, just for a moment, and then steadied, brighter, clearer. The smell of food drifted through the air. The laughter of his family filled the yard again, and this time he didn't feel like an intruder. "You know," he said quietly, "for all the running I did, all the universes I tore open, it's weird how it always comes back to this." Morty nodded. "Because this was the only thing that ever mattered." Rick let out a slow breath. "You really have grown up, huh?" Morty smiled faintly. Maybe, or maybe you finally caught up. They sat together in silence, watching the flickering family that wasn't entirely real but felt entirely true. Somewhere, a bird called out, its song slow, melodic, half lullaby, half reminder. Rick's gaze softened. You think they'll remember me? Morty tilted his head. They already do. Every version of you left something behind. A moment, a word, a spark. You think they all hated you, but most of them just missed you. Rick looked down. The grass beneath him glowed faintly, like it was alive with memory. He thought of all the Mortys he'd met, countless faces, countless choices. You're not one of them, are you? He asked. No, Morty said with a small smile. I'm the one who loved you anyway. Rick froze. The world around them shimmered brighter, like the words themselves had triggered something in the air. A faint vibration filled the space, the same hum, the same pulse that had guided him since the beginning. He closed his eyes, letting it move through him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. You always wanted me to say it back, didn't you? Morty shrugged, smiling gently. I didn't need you to. I already knew. Rick nodded slowly. Then after a long pause, he said, Yeah, but I should have anyway. The boy's expression softened, and for a heartbeat, Rick saw every version of him, the frightened one, the brave one, the broken one, the hopeful one, all flickering together in a kaleidoscope of memory. Thanks, Morty, he said quietly. Anytime, Rick. The air began to shift again, light folding inward, edges blurring. The laughter faded into the hum. The yard dissolved back into the lavender horizon. Morty's form began to blur. Rick stood, watching as everything melted into one long, luminous breath. Guess this is goodbye, he said softly. Morty shook his head, his voice barely a whisper now. Not goodbye, just good rest. Rick's throat tightened. Yeah, good rest. And then the boy was gone, his voice echoing faintly as the last fragments of the yard faded into light. Rick was alone again, but it didn't feel lonely. The silence was vast, filled with the heartbeat of everything he'd ever known. He felt lighter, as if every atom in him was exhaling after centuries of holding on. He looked upward. The sky above him began to open, revealing a slow drift of stars, not sharp and cold like before, but soft, dreamlike. They pulsed gently, each one carrying a memory, a moment, a life. He could feel them, his own creations, his own mistakes, all returning to something gentler than forgiveness. He smiled faintly. You win, universe, he whispered. You always did. The light deepened around him, cradling him like water. He lay back, staring at the cosmic expanse, his body dissolving into it grain by grain, until all that remained was the sound of breathing. Not his, not anyone's in particular, just existence itself, steady and eternal. Images drifted past him one last time, flashes of laughter, the clink of glasses, Morty's hand tugging at his sleeve, the quiet hum of the portal gun, then a memory of something smaller, almost insignificant. A sandwich left half-eaten on a workbench, its crust glowing faintly with portal dust. He smiled at the thought that even in the end, life had left crumbs of wonder behind. He could feel his consciousness stretching now, unraveling gently into the tapestry of light. He didn't resist. Every fragment of thought turned into warmth, every regret into music. Somewhere, he thought he heard Diane's laughter again, not as an echo this time, but as part of the same hum that had always been there, waiting for him to listen. He reached out once more, his fingers brushing the space where everything meant nothing. All right, he whispered, voice fading into starlight. I'm home. The hum swelled low and deep until it filled everything. Then just as it reached its peak, it fell silent. The light dimmed to a soft glow, the universe holding its breath. And then in that stillness, a voice, the narrator's calm and close, spoke gently to the listener. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man. The last word lingered, folded into the darkness. And somewhere, in the quiet space between heartbeats, Rick's laughter echoed once more, faint, distant, eternal.